Okay, we're not going to take a formal break. If you want to hit a bio break, whatever, just help yourself. But we're going to move right on to the next program, and I'd ask Brent Scowcroft and Marv Fertel to join me up here on the stage. Okay, folks, we're going to continue with our program, so if you're back getting coffee or whatnot, just do that a little quietly so that we don't disrupt the flow of the conversation. Thank you all again for coming today. Again, my name is John Hamry. I had the privilege of working with Mike Wallace on the study effort that we did here at CSIS. What we've done is with each of the sponsors, we've broken the day into some different segments. And so we're going to use this segment really as more of a framing question. Of course, for the topic immediately before us, as you can see in the program, is the challenges facing nuclear power. And of course, the first rule of public policy is to try to figure out what you're trying to do as a nation. So let me start, General Scowcroft, to say, I mean, as you think about, you know, your career has intersected and interwoven with nuclear energy and nuclear power pretty much throughout your time in government and now in private life. Secretary Poneman mentioned that you just headed up the Blue Ribbon Commission. So I wonder if you'd start us at a most broadly, you know, what are we trying to do as a nation? And as you look at that, what worries you about what we're doing?
Well, thank you, John. I started out in the nuclear business on the explosive end of it, not on the energy end of it. And I'm very much an amateur. But I think there are two general problems we face. The first one is an energy problem. And the world is facing energy demands that we only dimly appreciate now. The average energy use by an American citizen is multiple times that of a citizen in Africa, for example, or the Middle East or somewhere else. That will not continue. And as energy demand explodes, how do we meet it? That's the first requirement, and that's an enormous problem now. And you know, we can all applaud the shale gas and so on, but in a sense it has become a real danger, because now we don't have to think about that for a while, and we've got 20 or maybe 50 years or so when we can just put that aside because we've got plenty of energy. But that covers up the other kinds of things which are, along with the requirement for energy, comes a requirement for cleaner energy, carbon-free energy, and also the attendant problems of proliferation with the nuclear business. So I think those are the requirements that we face now. And they are all, well, let me say, solvable. We can deal with them all, but I don't think we are putting the attention that we need on any of them to solve the problem.
General, let me just ask a chance to dig just a little deeper into that second point, where you talk about the kind of the international implications of this. Now, historically, America was the kind of the lead country shaping the international normative architecture for managing nuclear power. When going back to President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace, you know, from that moment when he really created the intellectual framework that we still are trying to trying to implement. But that sort of assumed we would stay a leader in the industry. If America starts shutting down its nuclear power plants while the rest of the world is expanding, how are we going to be able to sustain our normative leadership role in securing the planet against proliferation, for example?
Well, that is one of the principal problems. How many nuclear plants around the world are being built by American enterprise? Not very many. And as we get out of the nuclear business, which we've been doing, Dan Poneman mentioned, we're just beginning our first plants after 3 Mile Island, which had a catastrophic psychological impact on the industry in this country. We are going to have no ability to deal with the proliferation issues that are attendant to the development of nuclear power if we're not a participant in the business. And there are over 60 countries now that are interested in one way or another in developing nuclear energy. Where are they going to get the enriched uranium? You know, there are two things you need for a nuclear weapon. The first is the material that you're going to explode, and the second is the technology to make the explosion. The long pole in that tent is the basic energy, the nuclear material that you need. And if we are not participants in that, we're going to face a runaway world in terms of nuclear proliferation.
Marv, and I should just say, colleagues, when we created this commission at CSIS for nuclear energy, future of nuclear energy, Bren Scowcroft was the co-chair and Mayo Shattuck was the other co-chair. Mayo couldn't be with us today, but so we traded up and we brought in Marv Fertel, who Marv heads the National Nuclear Energy Institute here in town, and that means he's the daddy rabbit for all things nuclear in the industry. That's a technical term, daddy rabbit. So Marv, I really need to pose this question to you, because where General Scowcroft was looking at the challenges and the imperatives from kind of a cosmic national sense, you have to look at it from the health of an industry that right now is under some stress. Share with us what that's like.
Sure. My wife could probably share what it's like better than I can. But let me pick up, John, to answer your, and first let me thank you and Third Way and the Bipartisan Policy Center and John Grossenbacher and INL, not only for the work you've done individually on this, but for the collaboration of doing this. As Secretary Poneman said, if we had a lot more of that collaboration going on, we might actually address much more significant issues like the fiscal crisis Senator Domenici raised and other crises we have in this country. But let me pick up and sort of start with what the Secretary mentioned as always number one for our industry, which is safe, reliable operations. And we believe we're focused on that all the time. We think while we don't always agree with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they are absolutely instrumental in making that happen. They are the most effective, most competent regulators in the world, though we don't always agree on everything. That doesn't detract from that statement. Commissioner Savinicki raised the question of prioritization. And I would say right now that's one of the most significant issues we face at our plants. We operate 104 plants. To be honest, we're very proud of them. 16 of the top 20 plants in the world are operated in America. So from an operational excellence standpoint, we have the benefit of IMPO, we have the benefit of a lot of experience, and we do it well. We always worry about complacency. I worry more about distraction right now. It's generally talked about in terms of money. So we have post-Fukushima resources we need to spend. We have other things we're doing at the plants to enhance safety. And it's not just money, okay? It's management time, it's resource attention. and you only have so much of all three of those aspects. So I couldn't endorse more the need for us as an industry, for our regulator as a regulator, to stay focused on what are the most important things from a safety standpoint, because that does represent a challenge. It also represents a challenge if we do too much. We've got 57,000 megawatts of coal-fired capacity shutting down between now and 2022 because of a combination of uncertainty on environmental requirements and shale gas. Okay, I don't know where shale gas prices will be in 2022, but the combination of those two things are causing companies to make those decisions. That puts certain smaller, older nuclear plants at risk too if we have too much burden that's unnecessary in the face of what appears to be a long-term supply of very inexpensive gas. So that's one of the big issues. The other issue that we deal with daily and had hearings last week that General Scowcroft testified on is moving forward with the used fuel management program in this country. We as an industry fully support what the Blue Ribbon Commission has come out with. We believe we need a new organization as they propose. We believe that consolidated storage is essential. We continue to support licensing of Yucca Mountain while we look at other repositories. But licensing of Yucca Mountain, at least in our estimate, if it was continued tomorrow, doesn't get us a repository till sometime between 2035 and 2045. We have a bunch of licenses that will expire, 60-year license now, in the 2030 timeframe. And we are going to need consolidated storage as an issue. We're going to have to get looking at low-level waste disposal as an issue for decommissioning some of those plants, and those are real. From a new plant standpoint, as referred earlier, we're building 4 plants, 2 in Georgia and 2 in South Carolina. Successfully completing those is absolutely essential. And I know most people immediately go to on schedule, on budget, but it's more than that. It's a new licensing process, not just to license it, but to oversee construction and to make a decision to start up. For us, we're doing modular construction. We're doing everything different and smarter than we did on the first 104 plants because technology allows that. We need to be successful on that because if we are, we think we take time to market from 10 years to 7 years. And that's a big difference in decision making. So that is a major thing. And then both you and General Scowcroft referred to the other thing is right now the rest of the world is building a lot more plants than us. Secretary Poneman referred to the fact that he's been told that they like American technology. Well, they should. Our technology is still the most advanced technology. Our passive safety systems are more advanced than anybody else's. We also have the best operators in the world, and everybody's looking for a combination of operations plus technology. And to be honest, I think countries that are starting up ought to look to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the regulatory framework that they want. One of the lessons learned out of Fukushima, not on the plant side, but on the government side, was the lack of a very effective regulator. And we shouldn't have that happen anywhere else as we go forward. So making it possible for us to export, which right now is very difficult. We compete against countries. Okay, when we compete against the French, it's France as a country. When we compete against the Russians, it's Russia as a country. When we compete against South Korea, they act like a country. When we compete against China, eventually they will be a country. So we need to be helped more by the government by removing obstacles and also helping to facilitate things to sell U.S. technology. And the last thing I would just touch on is with our debt crisis that we face as a nation, making sure our priorities on research and development in the government combined with the industry are appropriate is going to be critical, because otherwise we're going to spread a little money around a whole bunch of things and get no return on any of them.
Marv, of course, your industry, you've got 2 basic types. You've got regulated, public utility regulated energy generators, and you've got merchant suppliers. And the 2 cases, the 4 reactors that you've described, are living inside a regulated environment, so that a government entity is taking a longer view and saying, we know we're going to need this, and so we're willing to put in the tax base, or into the rate base, the cost of bringing this online so when we get it. But no merchant supplier can do that when it takes 9 years or 7 years even. So the government's going to have to play some role. If we're going to want to have a portfolio of energy supply where we've got diversity against price shock or political disruption or whatever, the government's going to have to play some role. We thought we could get that off the ground with the $20 billion startup fund, but that may not be enough for merchant suppliers. How are you thinking about this?
I mean, John, you've characterized the market situation very, very accurately. Clearly, where you have public utility commissions setting rates, and they can take a long-term view, and as Secretary Poneman said, when you think about a 60 to 80-year plant, the one thing I can be sure of is the cost of the electricity from the nuclear plant will go down and the cost of electricity from gas will go up. I can be very sure. I don't know the slope of the curve and I don't know the endpoints, but I can be very positive about that over time. But making a decision is very hard unless you're in a rate-regulated situation where the government takes a longer-term view. In a market situation right now, it's very hard. You mentioned a $20 billion loan guarantee program. It's still not being implemented effectively, okay, because Southern Company does not have their loan guarantee. We are perplexed by that. There is almost zero risk to the government. It's a corporate financing. It's on the Georgia Power balance sheet. It's very hard to understand the problem. So getting an effective loan guarantee program, and for a merchant, when we've looked at the modeling for a merchant, you would leverage much greater, probably 80-20 rather than 50-50 debt to equity, and that reduces the cost of electricity to the customer by about 4 cents per kilowatt hour, which allows you as a merchant to sign a pretty good PPA with large customers if you can build your plant. I think Secretary Poneman raised the possibility of clean energy standards, which I think the administration supports. The electric industry is not necessarily supportive of a lot of things that interfere in the markets that are not terribly supportive of a clean energy standard. We as a nuclear folks are certainly more supportive of a clean energy standard than a renewable portfolio standard because we'd like to be in the game that way. But again, it's not totally clear even that would do it. I think eventually, John, gas, while it's a much better source from a carbon emission than coal, still emits half as much as coal and emits potentially a lot of methane during development and pipelines. And I think that as General Scowcroft pointed out, the world is going to go to use more energy. We had about 2 billion people in the world that don't have electricity all the time, some not at all. And eventually they're going to get it. And if we are going to deal with greenhouse gas emissions and the potential for climate change, we're going to end up with requirements on even gas. So I think our environmental requirements, maybe our energy policy, but we've never had an energy policy. So I'm not sure that wanting one, I know the Third Way has called for that as part of the quadrennial reviews, and I certainly would support doing that. I've just never seen us effectively implement energy policy in this country at the federal level, let alone with 50 states doing their own thing. So when I look at it right now, and we look at it as an industry, for the near term, we look at the regulated states as the home for building more plants, to bring down the time to market, to get the technology embedded, to demonstrate both to boards and to governments the value to allow us to sell overseas, and that eventually our government policies may get there. But I know, and I was part of CSIS study, there's a lot of things we're asking for there that in the current debt situation, the current fiscal crisis, I think are hurdles that we cannot jump. So we ought to maybe go into paths where we can create a path for merchants down the road.
Well, I would at least, this has been my comment, but people say we can't afford in this fiscal climate to support nuclear energy, but somehow we're able to subsidize ethanol, with its cost. I mean, this is not a good economic model if you're honest about it. Or windmills. I'm the biggest windmill I know, but but I don't generate any electricity, and the average one out there is pumping it out about 10% efficiency.
I couldn't agree more. I think the vote in the Senate, which I think was like 72 senators voting against ethanol, was seminal, and I think it's indicative of the future. I think the debate right now on the production tax credit for wind is also indicative of the future. So I actually think, I think the suffering will go across the board as we deal with this fiscal cliff and this debt crisis that we have as a nation. And I think that our strategy on nuclear has to be, I mean, if I were going to pick three, first of all, we've got to operate our current plants the way we do, as safe as possible, and not overly burden them. Second, I think we need to build where we can build. And third, we need to export with robustness to show not only our technology as good as it is, but to make sure other people benefit from our technology and operating experience. And I think that in merchant markets we'll get there eventually, but it's not in the near term.
Indulge me to ask one last question to the General Scowcroft before I turn to you, and that is on this question of exports. We export, obviously, technology, although our companies are getting out of the business. We also export the credibility and legitimacy of our governance structure. Lots of people around the world. General, given the fact that we're kind of perilously on the edge of losing the industry here, what would you do if you were back in government if you wanted America to be kind of a lead, and especially this export avenue?
Well, I think there are several things we can do. We're taking good steps on the safety side. We've got huge cost problems, which are loaded down. Our fundamental problem, I think, is psychological. And there is a fear of radiation in this country that is astonishing. And it comes from 3 Mile Island, which was really not a catastrophe in any sense of the word, but it has just paralyzed us. And in the Blue Ribbon panel that I co-chaired, we went around and we held hearings around the country. And people would stand up and say, radiation is responsible for diabetes, for health care, for everything. And it's a psychological element that I think is easily dealt with. I think if we can get started, for example, nuclear waste, it has become a huge national problem. It is not a significant problem, really. If you look at all the nuclear waste that's been produced, it's about the size of 3 football fields, about 20 feet tall. But it's a huge psychological problem. We can solve it if we come to grips with it. Take nuclear waste, for example. Our commission put out just a common sense way to proceed. A consent-based process. Instead of cramming Yucca Mountain down the throats of Nevadans, have a bidding process. It works in Sweden, it works in Finland, it's working in Canada. It's complicated in the United States because of our federal structure, the state structure, and the local structure. In Nevada, for example, the local counties are strongly in favor of Yucca Mountain. It's the state who doesn't have the benefits that are there. But this common sense approach that in dealing with waste, which would, I think, be very effective. We completed our report in January. It is nowhere. And the momentum, the psychological momentum is disappearing. We suggested several things to keep it going. They haven't been done. Senator Bingaman is now, to his credit, trying to put together a bill which would embody what we have proposed. Senator Domenici mentioned the WIP plant in New Mexico. It's a fantastic operation, and this is a plant which stores only defense waste now, but is eager for more. The local community, the state community all supports it. I mean, I think with the right incentives, we could move forward rapidly. But there's just not the drive behind it. And if we can't develop some kind of energy policy, we're going to be behind the power curve, not only in energy, but even more importantly in proliferation.
Okay, let me open up the floor to colleagues, because we do have about 15, 20 minutes that we can get questions to the table. We've got microphones. People are going to be walking around. So just indicate that if you have a question, let me get started, because I could go all morning, but I want to. Oh, we've got a question right over here. Well, to this table.
Hi, Matt Bandick with
It's on. Yep.
Matt Bandick with SNL Energy. My question is for Mr. Fertel on the next project that I believe is up for review by the NRC in terms of new reactors would be Levy County in Florida. Are you all NEI concerned about this 24-month period of new license suspension by the NRC impacting that project or and the next new reactor in line?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we would have liked the court not to have vacated the waste confidence rule. We have confidence, first of all, that the commission and the staff are dedicated to correcting the issues the court raised and getting it done in the 2 years. Given the time frame for Levy, which, if I remember correctly, and don't hold me to this, I think the last date was like 2022 or 2024. I can't see a 2-year delay in issuance of the license, because the commission indicated all licensing should go on. You just can't issue the license. So you could be prepared to issue the license pretty close to whenever the waste confidence rule was again promulgated. So the simple answer to your question is I don't see it impacting the plant at all, because of when the plant would start operation and when the license could be issued.
While I'm waiting for another question, let me ask each of you your thoughts on the emergence of small modular reactors as both a development opportunity and for America to be in a leading role, and also what it would mean for us to be exporters of a new technology, small modular reactors. Marv, let's start with you.
I actually think it's a tremendous opportunity for our country. I think it's, Secretary Poneman mentioned public-private partnerships. This is a place where an effective public-private partnership is going to be essential, because to meet what Dr. Hamry just mentioned, which is sort of a leadership for our country, we have to get to market before some of the other countries. And we're going to go through licensing at the NRC, which is, like the gold seal when you get it. Nobody else goes through anything like that. So getting to market with these products sooner rather than later has tremendous advantage. I think the biggest market initially is probably, again, maybe externally, though I can tell you from talking with a lot of companies, both investor-owned utilities that operate nuclear plants and also particularly public power entities and rural electrics, there is a tremendous amount of interest in small modular reactors in our country. And you can do things that would allow them to, quote, be even safer and more secure than some of our bigger reactors right now. You probably need Exelons or other companies to help you operate them if you're not an operator today, but I think that's in the cards.
I think they're a tremendous idea. There's one psychological problem, and that is the not in my backyard syndrome. And it's bad enough for the big nuclear plants. The small modular reactors get around the tremendous capital cost problem which stifles the industry. But having smaller plants in many more places accentuates the psychological problem which we have to deal with, and I think we can deal with it, of the not in my backyard syndrome. I think it is almost entirely psychological, but to me it's a threat to the small modular reactor.
I would just say I'm becoming increasingly anxious about the vulnerability of national security installations to cyber disruption on commercial power grids. We made a decision 30 years ago to abandon organic DoD power generation because it wasn't affordable. But in this era of cyber disruption, and cyber wars started this summer, by the way. We have to start thinking about reliable sources. And the one thing about small modular reactors is there's still probably twice as much there as you'd need on a big installation, but it would be reliable and contained, and you wouldn't be dependent on pipelines, et cetera. So there's a real importance in that domain. I had a question over here. Yes, this lady right there, and microphone's right behind you, and then I'll come over here.
Hi, this is Sarah Hernest with Rad Waste Monitor. I wanted to return to waste confidence quickly if I could. Mr. Fertel, I understand that the NRC staff may be considering recommending that the environmental impact statements work on those be halted, suspended until the waste confidence is continued. I'm wondering if you've also heard that or if NEI is going to speak to that.
You're talking about the work on EISs for new plants. I think there's been some issue raised. We just sent a letter into the commission on that issue. First of all, we believe the commission was pretty clear, continue all your work. So we believe they can continue working on the final environmental impact statements, just like the hearing boards will hold waste confidence related issues in abeyance until the rule is done. You could do that there. So we do not see that as a problem. And we did send a letter in last week. So if you're interested in our arguments, you could go on our website or theirs and you could see it. So we don't see that as a reason to stop work on the FEISs right now.
Hi, it's Stephanie Cook from Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. I just wondered if Mr. Fertel could tell us how, kind of the time frame for SMR development and sort of how many reactors you see being developed and when you would see, exporting, real serious export efforts. I mean, obviously this is post-licensing, but maybe you could start with the licensing timetable.
The goal in the program, and I think on the industry side right now, is to have them deployed in the 2020 to 2022 timeframe. Obviously, one of the drivers there will be money, and both the industry investment and what partnership the government can have with that for the getting the licensing and all of the engineering done. And the NRC is in the process of putting in place the specific regulatory requirements for SMRs, and I think they're doing a very responsible job of doing that. But again, timing is probably uncertain. I couldn't venture a guess, to be honest with you, on, quote, the size of the export market in the early 2020s or the size of the domestic market. Each of the applicants trying to get into the DOE program have utility consortiums with them that are looking to deploy SMRs, and I think that some of that will depend in our country when we come out of the recession. I mean, we have still not recovered to the electricity demand that we had in 2007. Okay, so we are still not back to where we were in 2007 in demand. We are going to shut down a bunch of plants, as we mentioned, but we're going to replace them in the near term by gas. So it's going to be a case of what the demand is in that time frame as you get closer. Time to market for those plants, they're thinking is, on the order of 3 years. They're trying to make them like gas plants, 3 to 4 years, which will allow for better decision making, but I wouldn't venture a guess on numbers right now.
Charles Newstead, State Department. I'd just like to ask the panel what their feeling is about the non-proliferation situation as it stands, and do we have the right policies and the right capabilities to reduce proliferation. I'm concerned particularly about the fact that the Department of Homeland Security does not have any handle, really, on all the cargo containers that are coming into the country, and it'd be very easy to slip a bomb in. on a container. And the other thing is the increased ability to produce fissile material by breeding it with neutrons from either a fusion source, which has become easier. Laser fusion produces lots of neutrons. So I'm wondering what you feel should be done about the proliferation situation from those two aspects.
Well, I think there is a proliferation problem. And I think one can deal with it by what I would call internationalizing the fuel cycle. And that is, instead of any country that wants to enrich uranium to run its nuclear plants, the IAEA becomes the controller of nuclear enrichment, and there are a number of countries that enrich uranium now through a process of leasing the fuel to any country that wants nuclear power. You lease the fuel, you take it back after it's burned, and in that way you prevent the construction of nuclear enrichment plants, whether they're the centrifuge type now or whether they're newer technology, and that's the way I would do it. And I think it's quite manageable. We've had preliminary talks with the Russians about it, establishing a fuel bank where you go up and rent the fuel, if you will. But I think we need to be much more active.
If I could just step back to put a framework so that people that don't have the deep background you do on proliferation can understand that when we put in place the non-proliferation treaty structure, it was in an era when nuclear power was still largely parochial. Nations developed their own complete capacity, from mining to enriching to building power plants to managing the power plants. It was all inside that nation state. And so the logical security structure was to have binding treaties between nations about their behavior. But what's happened over the last 15 to 20 years is the nuclear industry has become a global industry. There are now global sources of supply for building reactors and global supply chains, and there are global sources of material. So this old parochial structure, where your security architecture was built on a single nation state's personal obligation, commitments to an international entity, are no longer adequate. It's too dynamic an international environment, and we need to adapt this security structure to reflect this much more dynamic international global market. What General Scowcroft is describing is really what we're going to have to move to, which is an international domain that's built around controlling the sources of the material, where it's a willing partnership between governments and the private sector with complete transparency. That's what he's really describing. It's where we have to move this away from this currently fairly sterile debate about the NPT treaty, because the fire lines are already developed on that. We still need the NPT treaty. It's no longer adequate. We need to go beyond it. So, Marv, last.
The only thing I would add to what my colleagues have said is that, as Secretary Poneman said, having U.S. exports successfully deployed in other countries increases not just our safety footprint, but it increases our non-proliferation footprint. So if you buy a U.S. reactor or you buy U.S. fuel, we maintain what we call consent rights, and you can't reprocess that material without our approval. And we need to do what we can to make sure we have what we call 123 agreements in place so that we can sell, and an effective export regime. So again, we can be in those markets, because I think every other major country that's selling would like to make sure proliferation issues don't arise. I have great confidence in our country doing that well, and think we'll do it as well, if not better, than anybody else. So I think us being in the market enhances our non-proliferation regime.
Colleagues, we've come.
I just want to say I think Marv is absolutely right, but So a country that thinks it may want to be a proliferator won't buy from us. They'll buy from somebody else. And so I think we need to internationalize the fuel cycle and put it under world control, if you will.
We could, this is a very rich conversation. Obviously, we could extend it well through the rest of the morning, but we need to make room for the next panel discussion. Again, we're not going to take a formal break because we are going to move into it. Help yourself to coffee. Bathrooms are out the hall. Please thank these two guys for their wonderful presentation.